Mark Azalea is an industry leader in psychotherapy and men's mental health. He's helped countless guys get back on their feet, deepen their relationships, and excel in their lives. Now he's taken all that he has learned and is sharing it with you. In each episode, Mark will interview an expert in the field of masculinity and men's work. We'll cover topics such as emotional intelligence, masculine identity, anger management, financial health, trauma recovery, marriage and divorce, ethics, and spirituality. Tune in and become a better man.
Welcome to the new show, Men's Therapy Podcast. I'm really excited to announce the rebrand of my show. It used to be From the Ashes, now our Men's Therapy Podcast. And just like the wonderful intro said, we're focusing on issues around masculinity, mental health, just anything that helps men get back on their feet or become better versions of themselves. Our first guest is Brad Wetzler. He's a friend of mine. I've known him for a long time. He's a journalist that's written for tons of magazines. I'm actually going to list out some of these right now. New York Times, GQ, Wired, Newsweek, Men's Journal, Outside, National Geographic, Yoga Journal. The list goes on. He's incredibly prolific. And he's here to talk about his book, Into the Soul of the World, which is a memoir that includes a lot of these themes that we want to cover in the show. So Brad, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm so happy to have you here because I think when we first met in Boulder, I got like a snippet of your story. I knew about the Jerusalem piece. I knew about kind of trying to discover who you were. I knew about some of the mental health recovery that you went through. But I'm really excited to learn, not just for our listeners, but for me, like how the story continued, and kind of where we go from there.
Yeah, when we first met, I was kind of early on in what was kind of a 10-year recovery effort after a really hard and fast and successful start in my life. And I think I remember meeting you. I was still soaked in shame and really struggling at that time. But it's great to be here, and I'm happy to tell that it's a different story now. So
that's awesome. Yeah, it's cool to see you on the other side, right? And I think what you went through is what so many men go through is, right, beating shame and trying to find place and trying to find initiation, right?
Yeah, exactly.
This idea of who am I? Do I have a place in this world?
Absolutely. And I think, those of us that missed getting that initiation, which is a lot of us. I think I once heard Robert Moore say, a few men get blessed and they make it an easier path in life, and the rest of us live in chaos through our 20s, 30s, 40s, and in my case, until I was early 50s. So yeah, it's something that men really need. I think I forget who said this quote. I should probably look these up as I get the show going. But there's one where it's motherhood, right? And women, you kind of get that biologically, right? There's something very innate where masculinity is earned, right? And it's earned through the sense of proving yourself, through being initiated, through challenging yourself, right? And growing through challenge and going through this difficulty and obstacles. So yeah, I think a lot of cultures have it. Our culture doesn't quite. And we have to kind of seek it out ourselves. Yeah, absolutely. Our politicians, our business leaders are evidence that there's a lot of uninitiated men out there, I think.
100%. Yeah. Well, so let's dive right into your story, man, because I know you've always been a seeker and you've been all over the world. You've had incredible experiences. What would you like to share with our listeners?
Yeah. So, I started out, I left graduate school as a journalist. I'd studied journalism in graduate school, and I landed a job the very next day. I started Outside magazine, and I was an editor there for 6 years. But the whole time I knew I wanted to be a travel writer, an adventure writer, just like the writers that I was editing. And so eventually, after I worked on the famous story Into Thin Air by John Krakauer, I left the magazine. I knew that was my time to go, and I went out and began working for the New York Times, Newsweek, Wired, GQ, all these places you mentioned, and was going on these adventures and finding myself in remote places and writing some incredible stories and having a great time on one level. But there was sort of a backstory that was happening. At age 24, around the time I'd started at the magazine, I had gone to a psychiatrist for depression, and 50 minutes later, after telling him a few stories about some mystical experiences I had as a kid, I walked out with a prescription for lithium. And so while I was traveling, I was struggling with both depression, and over time, I was getting more and more medicated. I did not have bipolar disorder. I would later find out. And eventually I was on 23 pills a day, 14 or 15 different medications, and I basically, was doing an assignment every now and then and stumbling around. Well, eventually my kidneys failed in Indonesia, and I literally walked into the ocean off a boat and had to be rescued. And that was that was one of the downturns. And then the next downturn, a friend of mine died by suicide. Well, long story short, I spent about 5 years practically in bed. The only thing that kept me up and around was high doses of dexedrine. So otherwise I would have been in bed for 5 years. So, and after that suicide, I just realized I had to, something woke up inside me, and I knew that I had to heal myself. I had to find other routes besides medications. And that's when kind of the journey began, and it led me around the world again to Israel, Palestine, a spiritual quest, but also hard work in therapy offices and yoga studios and all that stuff. But, 10 years later, I made it and healed the for the most part, I think, we can talk more about that, but man, I'm here. So.
Yeah. And that's awesome. Yeah. I mean, that's incredible. And there's so much I can go into. I guess I first want to say it's such a shame to get over medicated. Yeah. Right. And to have mystical or spiritual experience, I imagine in your generation, or you're a little older than me, like be pathologized, right? And be like, oh, that's mania, that's insanity, you're crazy, whatever, right? Yeah. Like we got to shut that down. Whereas I have to imagine those experiences are probably pretty meaningful and formative for you when you were younger.
They were very powerful and meaningful to me. And I was I was sort of a mystic as a kid. I mean, I played ball and did all the things, but I had this really deep connection with Jesus. And later on, I left that path behind. But those were incredibly meaningful times. It was a life raft for me too. And so there was validation in those mystical experiences. And, as my book will, those of you who read the book, I end up at age 55 having a 12-hour mystical experience in India. And I know that sounds, people go to India and have these mystical experiences, but it blew my mind. But then, the thing that actually hit it home, when I got home, I was seeing a psychiatrist who'd helped me get off most of these medications. And when I told him about that, he was as old school as you could get, but he was also, as bolder, and he had an open mind, and he was on his own journey. And he looked at me, he dropped his pen and said, I believe you. I believe that experience was real. I believe you deserved it. It doesn't happen to just anybody. And in some ways, that was as powerful of an initiation as this amazing mystical experience, this older man validating that mystical experience. So things had kind of come around full circle since being diagnosed and with mania. So,
yeah, really getting validated by someone who's a professional in that field, right? And being like, yeah, you're not crazy, right? Yes. Like this is real. Yeah, your experience is real. It's not something that has to get cut off or rejected.
Right. Yeah, it was incredible, validating. And, I think as we've talked and we started to hint at, I think a lot of this quest was an unconscious quest for validation. It was trying to please an impossible to please father. And I've had a difficult relationship with my father since I was 12. And, one of the backstories to the backstory was that when I was 12, I was on a canoe trip with him, and on a Fellowship of Christian Athletes canoe trip. And, well, we tipped over and I nearly drowned. My life jacket got snagged on a submerged log, and I was there for several minutes, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. And he was on the beach. I could see him, and he froze. He didn't come and get me. And eventually a boat rammed into me. But, well, that started kind of this distrust, I think, with him. And then when we got home, I went to tell my mother the story, and he stepped in front of me and said that it didn't happen that way, that I was exaggerating, that my shirt got snagged on a twig. And in fact, that refrain is, I'm not in contact with him now, but over the next 30, 40 years, that refrain, your shirt got snagged on a twig, that invalidation of that just, was one of many invalidations that led to the seeking journey, I think. So.
Yeah, I want to dive into that. I mean, it sounds like, it's protecting his own ego, right? Yeah. But in that, sacrificing your fear, right, and your validation. And that must have been a terrifying experience.
And then having to sit and process that alone, and later alcoholism in my family and that whole thing, and getting scapegoated. So it's it's the whole journey of someone who calls out the truth or his perception of the truth and gets punished for it, and that happens, in every street in every country of the country, So
Yeah, there's always like scapegoats, right? Or people that are whistleblowers end up getting blasted, right? Or canceled or whatever it is. Yeah, I want to take you back to the validation piece, right? Because I think so many young men, especially in the Western world, probably especially in America, do something similar, right? They go on these quests. They go to these like spiritual places, whether it be India or Jerusalem or Cambodia or whatever it is, right? And they're seeking something. Oftentimes they don't know what they're seeking. So I'm curious to give more detail. You said validation and love of your dad, but yeah, what else were you seeking? What were you trying to fill by doing all this stuff?
Yeah, I think, when long before the spiritual seeking journey, the explicit one began about 10 years ago, I would travel to these far off places and I'd get my work done as quickly as I could. And I would spend time in temples and churches and also just sacred natural places. I was just drawn to it. And, on some unconscious level. And I felt more myself in these places. I felt more deeply connected to something cosmic and bigger than myself. And I associated this feeling with those places, and I wasn't able to access that feeling, back home. And so, on some, unconscious level, maybe I was trying to recreate the experiences of my youth. I don't know, but there was something, you hear that word, a God-shaped hole. I definitely had that God-shaped hole that I tried to fill with sex, relationships. I now see the over-medication period in my life as addiction. And, I was seeking to become myself, but I didn't know how to do it. And it was just compulsive traveling. And at the same time, I was getting further traumatized on these trips often. I'd find myself in roadless places after long helicopter rides, unable to get out, and this kind of deep abandonment wound would come alive. And so it just layer upon layer. But yeah, seeking validation, seeking an understanding of what a man was, I think too. I didn't know what a good man was. I didn't have good models, and I didn't see them in my community really. I didn't see them in the business world. And it was, later when I began listening, a friend of mine gave me a set once when in the middle of a dark depression. A friend of mine, an older guy, gave me a set of tapes of Jack Cornfield and with a joint taped to the tapes, and I began listening to Jack Cornfield, and that kind of began and then later Ram Dass, and that began my, I began to see obviously the spiritual element of that, but the masculine element, the softer, open-hearted man, became something I had never seen before, ever. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. I mean, I had a similar thing with Jack Cornfield too, Ram Dass. I had it with Chogyam Trungpa from Europa, right? Just like getting these Robert Bly, right? Like many of my initiators in the beginning, I mean, my dad did a great job in some respects, but also a lot of it was like virtual or through books or through wisdom, right? I connected with Marcus Aurelius and meditation and all that stuff, but it was all, it all came from wisdom. And I think in that I felt connected, but also alone. I'm hearing something of what you're talking about, because I was like, where are the living people, right? Yeah. Like where's the community that talks about this? Where are other guys that have read these books? For I'm going to say 3 to 5 years, I felt like I was the only guy on the planet interacting with this stuff.
No, I hear you. And then when podcasts came along, and a lot of these guys ended up you were able to hear their voices, there was something healing and haunting about healing the gentleness in these masculine voices that just blew my mind. Yeah.
Yeah. The gentleness is crazy. Like the gentleness and the courage, right? Like they would say like the most vulnerable and true stuff, but say it with no judgment and say it with just complete care, right? Like it was a dad talking to a child, right? Of like, hey, this is what life is like, and I'm here with you. And
it was outside the lines of society. I mean, in a major way, which I always felt I was, probably because of some of the scapegoating I experienced. But then it became a blessing, and began to see there are paths out there that are askance from the straight societal line, and that validated that part of me. So,
yeah. What are some ways you feel like you didn't fit in with the like primary cultural narrative? Where was the rub for you?
Yeah, I guess I felt I felt I felt like an out, for a privileged white man, I felt like an outsider, often in my own body due to some PTSD stuff. And obviously, being pushed out of a family, you feel outside of, your family of origin. You carry that forward. But then, I think seeing that society was built around a capitalist society built around increasing your needs and fulfilling these needs that were never going to be met. And I felt like I also felt more gentle as a man inside. And I think that's something that I've been confused about my entire life. And I think I've confused a lot of women with it too. I look like I'm 6 foot tall and have now a white beard, and in some ways look like I could be a typical alpha male, but I've had a softness to me that I didn't know what to do with in some ways. And maybe I'm still working on that part of it. And there is a bit of a split, I think, still in that I'm trying to heal. Still trying to understand which I am. And I have a deep instinct that I am more of this softer man. And I've had a lot of leather put over my heart in a way. And yet, again, still trying to find that path and find where there is a place for that kind of man. So,
yeah, I really like what we're talking about. We're going to talk about that more when we come back from the break of what like male love looks like. I'm hearing what male compassion looks like, what mentorship and teaching look like, because I think that there's this one image of like the tough love drill sergeant type of dude, right? And I think that does work for some people. And I think it cuts off a lot of opportunity and potential,
Yeah. I look forward to that conversation. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to move to our first commercial break. When we get back, we're going to hear more about Brad and what male compassion and gentleness look like. So hang on in there and we'll see you on the other side.
Voice America is on LinkedIn. Connect with us today.
Men's Therapy Online is now accepting new members. Men's Therapy Online offers a solution to the lack of outlets for emotional expression, positive role models, and access to meaningful milestone experiences. In our post-COVID world, loneliness is at an all-time high. Men need consistent community. Our society is rapidly changing. Old models of masculinity are falling at the task of promoting emotional intelligence and meaningful connection. Men's Therapy Online offers tools and experiences designed to help the man who is struggling to balance traditional male roles and emotional fluidity. Whether you need to get back on your feet or take your life to the next level, Men's Therapy Online has your back. We help our members become a true 21st century man, a man who is not burdened by the rapid change of society, but who contributes to it honorably. If you're interested in signing up and finding your band of brothers, go to menstherapy.online to learn more. That's menstherapy.online. Start your journey today.
It's your world. Motivate, change, succeed. VoiceAmericaEmpowerment.com.
You are listening to the Men's Therapy Podcast with Mark Azalea. To reach the show today, please call 1-888-346-9141. That's 1-888-346-9141. Or send an email to podcast@menstherapy.online or visit www.menstherapypodcast.com. Now, back to the Men's Therapy Podcast.
Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Brad Wetzler, and he's the author of Into the Soul of the World, which is a memoir of his healing journey, traveling all around the world, experiencing spiritual sights, mystical experiences, and just really soaking in culture. I mean, it's an incredible thing to both do as a young man, as an adult, professionally, right? To just like be what I see is like really like a global citizen. It's pretty cool. So kind of building off our conversation from last time, I'm curious what your evolving definition of masculine love is, or masculine compassion. And I wonder if it's been informed by some of your travels, or if there's any stories that that highlight that for you.
I was in India just this past February, and I'd been pondering a next book idea that might have something to do with masculinity, and my eye caught two men, rickshaw drivers that were one of them had hit the other rickshaw, and they were out in front of their rickshaws discussing it, and I just noticed, they were carrying on a conversation. It was heated isn't even the right word. It was a vigorous conversation, and yet I could not detect any of that up and out anger, and there were no hand motions, there were no threats, there were no knives, no guns, and it was amazing to watch this. And I don't want to fetishize, Indian culture or Indian men, but there's something about that episode that told me that there is another way to be besides, who we often are in this country, filled with a lot of anger really substituting for any other depth of emotion. And so anyway, that's one little story that has recently happened that got me thinking about masculinity and regarding love, I think we have so much. I live in Texas now, and you have a lot of that vibe of the self-made man, the proud, the unyielding male, and all the work I've been doing. I'm in a relationship now for the past 2.5 years. It's been quite hard, and the work I've been doing is learning to turn toward. And it's such an easy, simple concept, but this sense of righteousness and rightness that we learn as young men, I think that is masculinity. We don't have to sacrifice our masculinity by softening and turning toward and having a more open heart and asking your partner what you need in this moment and those kinds of things. And so I think, and obviously I've been reading Terry Real, and there's a lot I like about his stuff, and just and bell hooks too, and just trying to understand a different way of relating that is less, my way or the highway, which is, even for a soft man like me, I got instilled upon me, so.
Yeah, there's so much of that. Like when I work with my guys, there's so much of like me against the world mentality, right? And I think some of the guys are the most angry and the most lonely that need help, right? And I've felt this way, so there's no judgment, but it's like me against the world, specifically other men, right? And then women are like the prize of that, right? Like if I win the game of men, then I get a hot wife.
Yeah.
And that's such like almost like dark Jedi shit, right? Like there's so much hatred, there's so much objectification that comes with that. There's so much like just rage,
and loneliness. There's so much loneliness in that, as you mentioned. I mean, the processing, the going home and trying to process we just don't learn how to even have good friendships. I found. I know you do a lot of men's work, and I was 53 years old when I started to see how my friendships were suffering. I was losing friends. How, on the other side of my kind of trauma recovery journey was opening my eyes to my own shit about relationships and with women and men. And so, and again, that turning toward, and I think, we just don't check in on each other either as men, which is an interesting, sad thing. I even the friendships I have today that are healthy and good, there's a certain way in which 2 weeks pass, 2.5 weeks, and then there's a text, hey, you want to grab coffee again? And, I think we just don't take care of each other like women do.
Yeah, it's so compartmentalized, right? Like it's just either tied to an activity or a schedule. There's not as much flow as it seems like there is in female relationships, right? Yeah,
a beer or pickleball or whatever. It's like, where's... But so
and if it's like, if the weather sucks, you're not talking to your friend for 3 weeks, right? Until you can get out again. I'm curious. So you talked about relationships, right? And you said you've been in a relationship for a while now, and you're working through how to turn towards. And I'm curious, right? We're talking about the masculine a lot, but I'm curious your impression of the feminine, and how do you bring those balance into a relationship?
Say more about that, Mark.
Yeah, so I guess one of the assumptions, hypotheses that I put forth in this podcast, right, that I've come to realize is that men and women are different, right? Equal, but different. And that's weirdly a taboo thing. I think with a lot of cultures moving towards everyone's the same, we're all one unit. Everything is like, just level, right? Or I think that there are gender differences, there are cultural differences, whether it's nature or nurture, it's kind of hard to tell, but I think men and women are different. And I think I try to take more of an equity model here, right? Of like, it's about, okay, understanding your partner, if you're in a heterosexual couple, partner's like unique needs, right? And then meeting them rather than just like doing what you think is right? Or just doing what you would want, And I guess I have to say for our listeners, right? Like masculine and feminine doesn't have to be sex assigned. They're genders, right? So you can have masculine women and feminine men, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think that there's something about that polarity between those two energies. So yeah, I guess I'm curious, like, have you thought about that? Do you see that play out in your relationship? How do you move between those? How do you lean into that?
Yeah.
Like,
can be another confusing thing. I think that, women have been conditioned by, our patriarchy to, you talk about the winning the prize. Well, there's a certain conditioning with some women anyway, that they move towards becoming that prize, and that there's a certain overt feminism or not feminism, but feminine way that has come to be normal in this country. But, I think I have had to learn about meeting needs, and there's a certain part of me that, being a spiritual person, there's a part of me that doesn't want to necessarily see needs as an important part of a relationship. If that makes sense to you, that a relationship is a container for self-growth and are both a mutual growth. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. But and I have resisted, really trying to accept and meet my partner's needs, but I've made a big move in that direction. It's not something that a relationship can survive without.
Yeah, it's been a struggle for me too, if I'm being honest, right? Like, I think some of my fiance's needs are things that, again, I don't know if it's good or bad, but like I can't even comprehend really. Like, again, whether that's a genetic difference or that's just like conditioning, I've repressed those. Right. I mean, there's a really great anecdote from John Gottman's work. There's a great book, Men's Guide to Women, where he talks about this, where he does this thing and he runs these big workshops. He's like a couples counselor. Right. And he says, hey, men in the room, when's the last time you've been afraid? Right. Men say, oh, I was climbing this mountain, or I was doing this like thing, or I was shooting guns, or like whatever, typical man shit. Right. And then women, you ask them and they're like, oh, walking to this workshop. Right. Like getting out of my car. Right. Like going home at night. And just like the fear level between men and women, it's just like incomprehensible.
Yeah.
And that's something that shows up in my relationship, where it's like I'm often in that soothing role and I don't feel afraid, right? Yeah. Because of privilege or conditioning or biology or whatever, right? But like my fiance does. And that's one edge I've had to really try to work and get into that.
Yeah. And I think I've done a lot of self-soothing over the years. Even though I've been in relationships, my go-to way to soothe myself is to come back to my apartment and open a book or sit on my deck and just overthink things and when in fact being more relational, I'm learning is a much better way to soothe, and that's an edge for me. I just want to separate and go home instead of connect, and it's still quite an edge for me.
I have the same thing. Yeah. I mean, I'm like that avoidant attachment. Like, I don't want to talk about it. I think I hold some misogyny views that like, if somebody helps me, it like makes me less powerful in some way. Yeah. Like I should be able to do it on my own,
and then you project that on your partner. Then you think she should have to do it on her own. So yeah,
100%. Yeah. So when the partner asks for help, I'm like, just figure it out. I don't know. Like I've had to figure it out, which is it's just rejecting, right? I mean, it's hurtful. It can be hurtful. Yeah, I think it's tough. So I'm curious, right? This is a question I'll probably weave into the show a bit. Is what do you see as modern masculinity? Because I think we're at a point where the old paradigm is failing, right? Like people know that, right? Like men are struggling. Toxic masculinity is destroying our boys. Like it just doesn't work. Right. But I think the more interesting question is, okay, where are we going? So I'm curious for you, where do you think we're going?
Yeah, wow, that's a big question. Yep. And I think, as somebody who's identified, I don't know if you've ever heard the term Sigma male. Have you ever heard that term?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if there's much validity to that idea, but, here in Texas, I've been raising this question as I've been trying to process my next book. And do you think the typical man, or in history, throughout history, do you think the essence of masculinity was more John Wayne or Keanu Reeves? You know, and throw those personalities out, but you know what the archetypes of those two are. And I have a hunch that it's more Keanu Reeves. I just do. I just think that, you know, especially as we've moved in the Western culture, and again with capitalism and corporate culture, it's become very bullying and very power. Yeah. You know, it is. I mean, obviously, masculinity and power are very connected. It's an important part of masculinity, but I think, you know, there's some way I think we've got to cut through just a power for power's sake and find a way to, you know, to relate again in a turning toward way. I'm just so appalled every day. I wake up and just read about the politics and the Elon Musks of the world, and it's just heartbreaking to see how normalized this is getting and how it's soaking into, you know, again, our boys and stuff here too. So yeah.
Have you seen this? Have you seen the thing about Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg doing a cage match?
Yeah,
dude. That's like to me, I think that's like fall of Rome, like opulence of the empire shit, right? That like literally like two of the richest men in the world are gonna fight in a cage to like determine if Twitter or Threads is better. Like it just,
I know. It's mind blowing to me too, you know? Mark. I'm older than you but I grew up in the 70s, and you know, it was still, the 60s was still close enough that there was a lot of, I had so much admiration at that time. There were softer men then, to be quite honest. There was, you know, I mean, Alan Alda was on MASH, and singer-songwriters, James Taylor, and all these heartfelt men, these romantic, poetic men. And they were kind of, for a while, the alphas in a way at that time. And it's gotten bizarre for me to see, nothing against tech people, but to see a different personality that's a much less emotional personality, perhaps, you know, rising to the top of the heap, so to speak, and winning the alpha females, and it's just, there's just a mind fuck that's happened for me to see that the lack of emotionality and relationality. That's what I'm really getting at, and that these are the men who are in power and the men that are setting the rules for society. It is a bit, there's a bit of psychopathy to some of this, I'll say. Yeah.
I agree. It's very strange, right? It's like, I see it like it's a perversion of like 1940s, right? Because there's a time in the 40s where scientists were the coolest shit, right? Like Albert Einstein, Robert Feynman, right? Like all these people was like, science was cool, and like we're helping to like improve the world and like learn cool stuff about physics and chemistry. Now it's like, it's not science, it's like the money that science gets you, right? Mm-hmm. It's like one step beyond the innovation. Because I think innovation and research is something that really that America really can stand, right? I think we have some of the brightest minds in the world, but when it gets perverted by this like capitalist piece, right? It's not understanding for understanding's sake, right? It's understanding for profit,
right?
So a different feel.
Well, and all you tech people out there, forgive me for this, but when I was a kid, you know, if you were an engineer, you literally had a pencil protector, and you worked for 3M on like their next brand of tape. And I mean, this is my own image of it. So I sometimes think of Elon Musk as like in some corner in some office trying to perfect, you know, double-sided tape or something. So.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And it's like, I mean, these people, they have such big platforms, and I think they could really benefit from some of the gentleness or poet,
right,
you know, that you're talking about, right? When you think about, like Cat Stevens, right, or like the Robert Bly, or these kind of people that are like saying something deep. So say more about that, right? Like, what kind of gentleness would you like to project into the world? I think we're kind of dancing around that topic.
Yeah. Wow, another big question. I appreciate it.
We do here.
Yeah. You know, I think it's really just at this point focusing on the process. I mean, I think it's probably too much to think about an end result of a more gentle masculinity, but what can we do on a day by day basis to you know, soften our hearts? I can't remember if it was Meister Eckhart or something talks about, you know, just these layers of leather over our heart, as I mentioned, and this quote about that, and how over time, it just gets layer upon layer upon layer. And I think the thing we can do is, this is what takes me back to spirituality, and to not necessarily a woo-woo spirituality, but just doing things like metta meditation or self-forgiveness meditation and breathing exercises, anything to slow down and try to feel again. I think a lot of my work after getting off the medications was learning to feel again. And there's a way for me anyway that I think as I began to feel more, I felt more connected to my soul. And I'm not even sure what I mean by that word soul. It's in the title of my book, and it's something about our essence. There's something connection with the soul of the world. But I think for me, it's through the feeling function in a way. The more I can feel, the more I can come back to my essence. And I think if, obviously therapy, things you're doing, to help men get out of just the anger mode and find some subtlety of feeling, that's such an important thing.
I agree completely, right? Like, I think men, our superpower and our biological function for most of history is being able to go Terminator mode, as I like to call it, right? It's like cut it off and like do the thing, like kill the thing, build the thing, save the person, right? But like, especially, again, this is a privileged conversation, but in privileged Western culture, like, we don't need that anymore.
No.
We're okay, right? We've been okay actually for a while. And I think our hardware is still catching up with the fact that we're pretty safe now. And I think as men, we don't know how to live in peace. We know how to live in war. We're actually kind of bred for war. But peace is very hard for men. And I think it's exactly what we're talking about. It's like slowing down, breathing, feeling, being more alive ultimately.
Yeah.
Right?
Stepping away from the computer, one thing where you just live in your head all day. So
not having to just like cut yourself off from the neck down.
Right.
So yeah, I think when we come back, I want to talk more about spirituality, some of the spiritual beliefs, how I think men need that. I think that we talked about before, that God-shaped hole that's really common, whether it be, religion or spirituality or connection, whatever you want to call it. I think a lot of guys are missing that. And I want to hear about how you're working on that and what that journey has been so far. For those listening, thanks for supporting the podcast, and we'll see you on the other side of the commercial break.
Follow Voice America at facebook.com/Voice America for juicy updates from your favorite radio shows and podcasts.
Men's Therapy Online is now accepting new members. Men's Therapy Online offers a solution to the lack of outlets for emotional expression, positive role models, and access to meaningful milestone experiences. In our post-COVID world, loneliness is at an all-time high. Men need consistent community. Our society is rapidly changing. Old models of masculinity are falling at the task of promoting emotional intelligence and meaningful connection. Men's Therapy Online offers tools and experiences designed to help the man who is struggling to balance traditional male roles and emotional fluidity. Whether you need to get back on your feet or take your life to the next level, Men's Therapy Online has your back. We help our members become a true 21st century man, a man who is not burdened by the rapid change of society, but who contributes to it honorably. If you're interested in signing up and finding your band of brothers, go to menstherapy.online to learn more. That's menstherapy.online. Start your journey today.
It's your world. Motivate, change, succeed. VoiceAmericaEmpowerment.com.
You are listening to the Men's Therapy Podcast with Mark Azalea. To reach the show today, please call 1-888-346-9141. That's 1-888-346-9141. Or send an email to podcast@menstherapy.online or visit www.menstherapypodcast.com. Now, back to the Men's Therapy Podcast.
Welcome back to the show. Here with Brad Wetzler, the author of Into the Soul of the World. And we're going to talk about the soul of the world. I really want to talk to you about spirituality. It's something that, I guess I've, give you a little context, gone through waves of, I was a seeker, I was born culturally Jewish, but didn't connect too much to that. Studied a lot of like Buddhism, Hinduism, did meditation retreats, a ton of those. I'm doing nature connection stuff. I'm about to go on a vision quest, but like, I don't know, like it's something that's important, but I don't have a grasp on yet.
Yeah.
You know, I'm kind of doing what I see as kind of a male process of like just throwing myself into situations and listening, you know, like growing through challenge and growing through adversity. But yeah, but I'm curious about you, right? Like it sounds like you've had a mystical connection in some form or another your whole life.
Yeah.
As well. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. You know, again, when I was a kid, I had this deep connection with Jesus and, you know, would listen to Jesus Christ Superstar over and over again. And just, you know, the fascination with this man who was compassionate and strong and said truth to power. That was my obsession with it. It was less, I mean, it was a deeply religious experience, but it was also a masculine, I mean, an admiration of his masculinity. Again, this softer but strong masculinity. But then I left that behind when I went to college and I found the beat writers. And for a while that became my religion. And then I was a grumpy journalist, an atheist for a long time. And I actually equate that period with my downfall a bit, that I had gone away from a spiritual life. And so in midlife, after I wandered around Israel and Palestine trying to see if I could believe in Jesus again, which is part of the book, I came home knowing I couldn't, but I did come home having my heart opened and knowing that spirituality had to be a part of my journey forward. And I went down the yoga rabbit hole. I dabbled in Buddhism like you did, and, you know, I've done a lot of reading and studying of those traditions. And, you know, and then more recently, and I know you know, I sort of fell into the Jung rabbit hole, and that's really, it's brought some interesting perspectives and changed my spirituality a bit. I do now see the ways that my Eastern dabbling can be ego driven in a way, and that there's some depth that I'm not able to get through that path. But, you know, to cut to the chase here, I just do think that the fact that religion has played such a central role in in human lives over the millennia is proof in itself that we are a religious people, spiritual people. I mean, whether or not there's a God, an external God, or whatever you want to talk about, we are wired for God, and which is sort of the title I'm playing with for my next book. And you know, and I think when you accept that and take the pressure off of the need for scientific proof of God, I think that's a setup. We'll never have it, and in fact, it's actually antithetical to the notion of God. And so, you know, I talk in my book about during the Enlightenment, the word faith and belief changed dramatically. Before the Enlightenment, there was a sense of having faith was to steep in something. You know, like whether you're a Christian, you steeped in this religion of Jesus, you know, and in Jesus Christ himself, or with the energy of that. And after the Enlightenment, you know, we became much more fact-based thinkers, and we linguistically screwed ourselves by, you know, to believe in something required an object to believe in, and those sentences no longer made sense to have faith or to have a deep belief in something beyond, and we just we tricked ourselves out of the ability. And so I'm just right now I've really landed in a place. I'm still deeply on a yogic path, but I'm also you know, I'm now playing more with my faith, and also the idea that we can develop it. I think I'm a man with a lot of doubt. You know, I just have a lot of doubt. I'll always be pulled. I'll go to bed a firm believer in God. I'll wake up, you know, you're so ridiculous. You've got, you know, you're a man of science too, and there's a certain push pull with that. But I think softening, again, in other words, softening around these concepts and opening and accepting that these are concepts that have smooth, not rough edge, they're not squares, you know, they're not the concepts that have easily definable edges. They're soft concepts that we can feel into and not need empirical proof on. So that's kind of where, that's a long journey, but that's kind of where I am right now. I've been rereading the Bible, in fact, as well as staying on this other path I'm on, and with plans to go back to India. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but there's a lot of complexity to that. But I think I spend a lot of time. I wake up very early, not by choice. I wake up at about 4:45, and I spend a good 2 hours in kind of quiet contemplation, reading, and not so much a formal practice even anymore right now. Just dim light and some chanting music and just being present. That to me feels as powerful and as useful as really, a very rigorous meditation practice. So,
yeah, I like that a lot, right? Just creating space to listen and to surrender and to see what arises, Like,
and I do think something arises, I do think I become more present to not only my dreams, but to things that happen in my reality. And thanks again to Jung, I no longer see things as coincidences. I was going through something last week and intense, and some wasps came and built their nest on my deck. And a year ago when I was finishing my book, I was feeling really connected to my soul, and I seemed to be surrounded by white doves. And now this sounds like the ravings of a madman, but I think when you start to listen, you see the soul of the world start to come out of this. It might actually be speaking to you,
Yeah, I do. I mean, I said I'm going on Vision Quest for the first time in a couple weeks, which is like 10 days out in nature solo, fasting for 4 of them. And it's that type of idea of trying to go out and listen. And
yeah.
Again, I don't really have a cosmology. I'm not sure if I'm at like believing in a deity or anything yet. But I want to track realness, right?
Yeah.
And for me, yoga was an entry into that, of being like, well, my body feels deeper than I could even comprehend. Some psychedelic use in my younger years was, I think, the original gateway to that. Like silent meditation retreat opens that up, just being like, whoa, there is more to reality. I don't know what it is. I don't really care about finding an answer, right?
Yeah.
Like I don't need to have like a dogma, but I do want to experience it. I do want to feel something that feels out of the ordinary,
Yeah, and reality, I mean, there's a lot of thinkers and theologians have talked about reality being, God comes at you disguised as reality, and I think we get caught in the West with this idea about, how could there be suffering if there's a God? But I think they don't have that problem in the East. They have this acceptance that God comes in many ways, and he comes as reality. There was a prayer that I started using a few months ago. I read from Richard Rohr, and I think it's a Franciscan prayer, but it's just 2 lines. Who are you, God, and who am I? And just repeating those lines over and over again as a prayer and listening is pretty powerful, I'm noticing. So
that's pretty cool. Yeah. Like
not having no certainty, right? The absence of certainty. So
and just questioning, right? Just questioning and listening.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know. I don't want to, it's weird. I would never say this as a younger person, but I do think our culture needs some sort of spirituality, whether that be, and again, I boil that down to like a sense of belonging, a sense of ethics, a sense of compassion, right? Like whatever form that takes doesn't really matter to me. But I think like the stuff that I imagine came with that is, I think, really, really needed.
Yeah.
Feeling like we're all in a community. We're not just like fighting all the time.
Yeah, and I know there's a cliche about us Westerners discovering yoga and Eastern wisdom, but when I discovered yoga philosophy and learned even the simple yamas and niyamas, there's an ethics system. I'd rejected my Christianity by that point, but I was living without any kind of ethical system, and it was nice to see an ethical system I could get behind. And then also in a yoga class, I think one of my first yoga classes after getting off of all those drugs, it was just your typical Dharma talk from a teacher who was probably 26 years old, and yet it was so profound at the time. I remember talking about how we are lights within, and and this sort of light might get tarnished up a bit. And our work as in yoga class or in prayer or whatever is to polish that light, which was a big difference between what I grew up with original sin. And so that began to lead me back again, to circle back to this gentleness and softness, that there's a way we are okay inside rather than deeply broken. And that was a big shift for me to start to embrace that.
Yeah, that was my main shift too in Eastern philosophy.
Yeah.
Right. Of like not feeling because Western's like downtown your original sin, you're like a beast, right? You're like a savage creature. You're like only id, right? Where it's like,
right.
That sucks. I mean, again, it's hard to know what's true, but like you can pick what you want to believe. And I would much rather believe that I'm like an open, spiritual, loving creature. And yeah, sometimes I fuck up and sometimes I have to polish that up or dig out the mud. But like ultimately, there's basic goodness there.
Yeah. Well, and I think the original Greek, to sin means to miss the mark only. It doesn't mean, that you are a horrible person. And so even Christianity got warped from its original intent. So, yeah. Yeah,
the whole final judgment thing really, screwed it up. Jewish religion, there isn't that, right? There isn't like a final judgment. Like you're all
judged all the time.
Yeah, we're guilted all the time, right? By our moms.
Yeah.
It's not by God. But there is this like ethical debate piece that comes up of like, yes, if you make a mistake, you have to make amends, right? Like you don't just get away with it, but it's not like you're going to burn in hell forever,
Right. Well, in the East, you'll come back as some insect or worse, in your next life. But yeah,
be a worm or like a donkey's testicle or whatever, right? Like that's your punishment. Well, Brad, we got to start to wrap up. There's a lot of good stuff here. I can't wait to have you on the show again. But as we're wrapping up, where can people find you online if they want to know more about you and your book and what you do out there?
Yeah, you can find me at bradwetzler.com, and that's BRAD and WETZLER.com. And you can find out about my courses. I teach memoir courses, transformative memoir courses. If you've had a hard journey in life, I'd love to help you write about it, to heal, and maybe to publish too. And then that's the essential way. My book is available at Amazon and other booksellers. It's called Into the Soul of the World, My Journey to Healing. And I would love it if you bought it and read it. It's quite a story. I was an adventure writer by training, and so this journey of recovery is told a bit as an adventure. It's a page turner. So
that's awesome. Yeah. Thank you all for tuning in. Go check out the book. It's awesome. Like Into the Soul of the World. Give it an order. Give it a pre-order. Like really, really give it a read. I think there's a lot of good stuff there. So yeah, thanks for tuning in to Men's Therapy Podcast, our inaugural episode. We'll keep moving forward and niche down the show and just talking to guys out there that want something more, right? That want like a little bit more depth, that want some more healing, that know that the only way forward is through. So if you're one of those guys, keep tuning in and the show's going to keep getting better and better. So thanks so much. And we'll see you next week on another episode of Men's Therapy Podcast.
Thank you for joining your host, Mark Aguilar, on the Men's Therapy Podcast. Be sure to tune in again live next Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time and 11 a.m. Pacific Time on the Voice America Empowerment Channel and anywhere podcasts are found. To support the show, leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. For more information or to apply to be a guest, visit www.menstherapypodcast.com.